According to the oldest survival accounts of the North Atlantic, the greatest danger in the ocean wasn't a predator that hunted you. It was a predator that waited for you to come to it. The most disturbing reports from early seafarers didn't describe a creature actively pursuing their vessels. Instead, they described a terrifying phenomenon, a sudden, inexplicable shallowing of the water in the middle of the deep ocean. The water would turn dark. A bizarre, almost sweet perfume would rise from the surface. In the mist, sailors would spot what looked like a small, uncharted island covered in seaweed. Desperate for solid ground, some crews would row out and step onto the rocky surface, even lighting small cook fires to warm themselves. But the island was breathing. When the heat of the fire penetrated the surface, the ground would violently shudder. The island would begin to sink, creating a massive, inescapable whirlpool that dragged the entire crew down into the freezing black waters. This specific, deeply unsettling behavior changes everything we think we know about this legend. Because this isn't the story of a monster that wanted to destroy ships. It is the story of a biological trap. We think we know what this creature is. We have given it a name, classified it in our textbooks, and reduced it to a pop culture punchline. But the deeper you look into the historical record, the more the accepted scientific explanation falls apart. The biology doesn't match the history. The physical evidence contradicts the earliest warnings. The truly terrifying part of this legend isn't what the monster was thought to be. It is the realization that the ancient sailors weren't imagining things at all. They were witnessing something real, something incredibly violent, and something that modern science completely misunderstood until just a few years ago. By the time the Danish-Norwegian bishop Erik Pontoppidan published his monumental work, The Natural History of Norway, in 1752, the creature had acquired a name, the Kraken, derived from an Old Norse word meaning a crooked tree or a deformed, twisted shape. The name was originally spoken as a hushed euphemism. Sailors believed that saying its true name aloud would summon it from the abyss. Pontoppidan's account crystallized the terror of the North Atlantic. He described a beast, incontestably the largest sea monster in the world, claiming its back measured 1.5 miles in circumference. He noted that when the creature rested just below the surface, it looked like a collection of rocky skerries, surrounded by swaying seaweed. But Pontoppidan recorded a detail that baffled naturalists for centuries. He wrote that the creature emitted a strong, peculiar scent to beguile and draw other fish toward it. It was said that the monster would digest its food for 3 months, producing such a colossal amount of nutrient-rich waste that massive schools of fish were drawn to the waters directly above it. Fishermen of the era faced a deadly gamble. If a crew found an unexpected shallow patch in the deep ocean, teeming with an impossible abundance of fish, they knew exactly what was happening. They were floating directly over the rising back of the monster. There was even a phrase for men who returned to port with impossibly large hauls. He fished on the Kraken. To stay and fill the nets meant securing immense wealth. To stay a second too long meant being annihilated by the maelstrom when the creature finally submerged. One detail simply doesn't fit. By the early 19th century, the scientific community began to agree that the Kraken was likely a gigantic cephalopod, a colossal squid or octopus. But cephalopods do not act like islands. They do not float passively on the surface for days at a time. They do not emit sweet perfumes to lure prey. If the Kraken was just a giant squid, then the most specific, terrifying details of the Norwegian folklore were completely wrong. So, what exactly were these sailors standing on? To understand the disconnect between the myth and the animal, we have to look at what happens when humans actually encounter the nightmares of the deep. In 1851, Herman Melville published Moby Dick, an epic drawn heavily from the real-world experiences and superstitions of professional whalers. In chapter 59, the crew of the Pequod is sailing near the island of Java when a lookout spots a massive white shape heaving in the water. Assuming they have finally found the legendary white whale, Captain Ahab orders the harpoon boats into the water. But when they row close, they do not find a whale. Instead, they find a vast, pulpy, cream-colored mass floating on the surface with innumerable long arms radiating from its center, curling and twisting like a nest of anacondas. The creature has no perceptible face, no eyes they can see, and no discernible consciousness. It is just a blind, undulating horror. The first mate, Starbuck, is so deeply unsettled by the sight that he tells the captain he would rather fight Moby Dick himself than look at this white ghost. Melville was capturing a very real dread. Whalers knew these creatures existed because they routinely found their severed, 20-foot tentacles inside the stomachs of the sperm whales they slaughtered. They saw the massive, circular scars carved into the whale's skin by serrated suction cups. They knew that deep in the black trenches of the ocean, a silent, titanic war was constantly raging between mammalian leviathans and something ancient and multi-armed. But knowing something exists is very different from proving it to the world. That proof arrived on the 30th of November 1861, off the coast of Tenerife in the Canary Islands. The French naval corvette Electon, commanded by Captain Frederick Bouyer, was cutting through calm waters when the lookout spotted a colossal mass drifting on the surface. It was a dying giant squid, its mantle alone estimated at over 15 feet long, not counting the lethal, grasping tentacles. Captain Bouyer, realizing the scientific magnitude of the moment, ordered his men to capture it. What followed was a surreal, 3-hour battle. The crew fired muskets and shells into the beast, but the projectiles seemed to do little damage to the creature's dense, rubbery flesh. The monster refused to die, diving and resurfacing around the hull. Finally, a sailor managed to slip a rope lasso around the creature's body, but as the crew strained at the winches to haul the Titan aboard, the immense weight of the animal combined with the sharp angle of the rope sliced straight through its soft tissues. The massive head and tentacles slipped back into the abyss. All the crew managed to haul onto the deck was a single 14-kilogram piece of the tail fin. Captain Bouyer delivered the rotting fragment to the French Academy of Sciences. The scientific community could no longer deny the truth. The Danish zoologist Japetus Steenstrup had previously classified the creature based on washed-up beaks, giving it the imposing scientific name Architeuthis dux, the ruling squid. But bringing the monster into the light of science didn't kill the terror. In fact, what happened next proved that scientific obsession could be far more destructive than any myth. Before the Electon incident, a French naturalist named Pierre Denis de Montfort made it his life's mission to prove the existence of the beast. In 1801, he published a massive encyclopedia of mollusks, featuring a now infamous illustration titled Le Poulpe Colossal. The engraving depicted a demonic, giant octopus reaching out of the waves, wrapping its thick tentacles around the masts of a sailing ship, and snapping the vessel in half. Montfort was a brilliant malacologist, successfully classifying over 100 species of mollusks that are still recognized today. But he became completely consumed by the legend. He began gathering accounts from French sailors in Angola who claimed they had been attacked. He read ancient Roman texts about monsters pulling shipwrecked men under the waves. Then, he went too far. In 1782, a fleet of 10 British warships, including the massive ship of the line Ville de Paris, vanished without a trace in the Atlantic. It was a staggering loss of life and military hardware. Montfort publicly and confidently declared that the entire fleet had been dragged to the bottom of the sea in a coordinated attack by a swarm of colossal octopuses. This was a fatal error. The British Admiralty knew exactly what had happened to their fleet. The ships had been caught in a catastrophic hurricane off the coast of Newfoundland. The British establishment mercilessly ridiculed Montfort. His reputation as a scientist was obliterated overnight. He was ousted from academic circles, his life's work reduced to a joke. He eventually died wandering the streets of Paris in absolute poverty. Montfort had destroyed himself trying to prove that the Kraken was an aggressive ship-sinking cephalopod. And yet, decades after his death, when the Electon brought back physical proof of the Architeuthis, the world adopted Montfort's nightmarish vision anyway. Jules Verne used the Electon incident as direct inspiration for his 1870 novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, painting the creature as a bloodthirsty monster that attacks Captain Nemo's submarine. The public was satisfied. The mystery was considered solved. The Kraken was just the Architeuthis dux, the giant squid. But one glaring question remained completely unanswered. If the monster was simply a giant squid, then centuries of specific, detailed folklore made absolutely no sense. Giant squids do not float passively on the surface looking like islands. Their flesh is heavily laced with ammonium chloride, which gives them a neutral buoyancy in the deep ocean. But it also means they taste terrible and do not emit a sweet, alluring perfume to attract fish. Furthermore, a giant squid lacks the physical mass and gravity-defying muscle density to wrap around a wooden ship's hull and capsize it. For over a century, historians simply assumed the Norwegian sailors had embellished their stories. They assumed the fishermen saw the rotting corpses of giant squids floating on the surface, heavily scarred by sperm whales, and their imaginations filled in the rest. But in 2011, marine biologists off the coast of Vancouver Island noticed something that forced them to rewrite the textbooks. They observed humpback whales engaging in a feeding behavior that had never been scientifically documented. Instead of aggressively lunging at schools of fish or blowing nets of bubbles to corral them, these whales were doing something shockingly passive. A whale would rise to the surface, orient its massive body vertically, and open its jaws to a perfect right angle. It would remain completely motionless, with its jaws hovering just at the waterline. When seabirds began diving to hunt juvenile herring, the panicked fish would desperately look for a dark place to hide. Seeing the cavernous, shadowy black mouth of the whale, the entire school of fish would instinctively swim directly inside, believing it to be a safe, underwater cave. Once the mouth was full, the whale simply snapped its jaws shut. Researchers called this trap feeding, but the most fascinating detail came when the whales regurgitated filtered water and digested matter. This created a pungent, distinctive odor that drifted across the surface of the water, specifically attracting more prey and scavengers to the area. In 2023, Dr. John McCarthy, a maritime archaeologist at Flinders University in Australia, realized something chilling. He was reading a 13th-century-old Norwegian text called the Konungs Skugg Sja, or the King's Mirror. The text described a monster that predated the name Kraken. It was called the Hafgufa, which translates to sea mist. The 800-year-old manuscript read, "When it is hungry, it opens its mouth and exhales a certain kind of good-smelling odor, the smell of which, once the smaller fish have perceived it, they gather themselves in its mouth. But when his mouth is filled, he suddenly closes his mouth and swallows them." For centuries, medieval scholars had dismissed the Hafgufa as a Christian allegory, assuming the sweet perfume represented the deceptive lure of the devil, trapping those of small faith. They were wrong. It wasn't an allegory. It was an incredibly precise biological observation of trap-feeding whales, recorded by Viking seafarers hundreds of years before modern science discovered it. The ancient sailors weren't lying when they reported an island that breathed, a beast that made the water shallow, and a sweet perfume that attracted massive swarms of fish. they were describing a whale holding its jaws open at the surface. And when that massive creature finally closed its mouth and sank, the displacement of thousands of tons of water would create a localized whirlpool, a maelstrom fully capable of destabilizing and sinking a small, wooden Viking boat that had drifted too close. This is how a legend is truly born. It is never just a hallucination. It is the collision of two terrifying truths. On one hand, early Scandinavian sailors observed rorqual whales trap feeding, hanging motionless in the water like islands, emitting strange scents, and swallowing entire schools of fish. On the other hand, they occasionally found the horrific, multi-armed corpses of giant squids washing ashore, or witnessed the violent aftermath of a sperm whale battling a cephalopod in the deep. In the minds of the people who had to survive in those dark, freezing waters, these two biological realities merged. The trap, feeding behavior of the whale was grafted onto the nightmarish anatomy of the squid. The Hafgufa became the Kraken. But if you think that separating the myth into two real animals makes the ocean any less terrifying, you are vastly underestimating the reality of the deep. In 2004, Japanese researchers Tsunemi Kubodera and Kyoichi Mori finally achieved the impossible. They lowered a camera and a baited line deep into the Pacific Ocean and captured the first ever photographs of a living Architeuthis dux in the wild. The footage destroyed the last comforting assumption marine biologists held. Scientists had long believed that the giant squid, due to its size and the freezing temperatures of its habitat, was a slow, passive drifter that simply waited for prey to bump into its tentacles. The images showed a 26-foot monster attacking the bait horizontally with terrifying speed and aggression. It wrapped its tentacles around the prey in a constricting ball, fighting the mechanical winch for over 4 hours. It was not a scavenger. It was an apex predator perfectly designed for the abyss, hunting with eyes the size of basketballs. Engineered to detect the faintest glimmer of bioluminescence in total darkness. Then, in 2013, a genetic study completely reframed our understanding of these creatures. A team at the University of Copenhagen analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of 43 giant squids collected from oceans all over the world, from Florida to Japan to New Zealand. For years, taxonomists believed there were as many as 21 different species of giant squid scattered across the globe. But the genetic sequencing revealed a shocking truth. The genetic diversity of the giant squid is almost non-existent. A squid found in the Atlantic is virtually genetically identical to one found off the coast of Japan. There is only one global species of giant squid, Architeuthis dux. The only way a species can have such incredibly low genetic diversity is if it survived a catastrophic population bottleneck. Sometime in the ancient past, nearly every giant squid on Earth was wiped out. Today, every massive shadow-dwelling squid in every ocean on the planet is descended from a tiny, isolated group of survivors that somehow endured an extinction-level event. They are the heirs to a shattered kingdom. In 1830, long before cameras reached the deep, the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote a sonnet that perfectly captured the true horror of this creature. He didn't write about a monster wrapping its arms around a pirate ship. He wrote about something far more tragic and far more unsettling. In his poem, simply titled The Kraken, Tennyson describes an ancient, isolated being sleeping far beneath the thunders of the upper deep. It slumbers in a dreamless, uninvaded dark, surrounded by giant sea worms and pale light. But the poem ends with a chilling prophecy. Tennyson writes that the creature will remain hidden in the abyss until the latter fire shall heat the deep. Then once by man and angels to be seen, In roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. Tennyson was writing at the height of the Industrial Revolution, a time when scientific progress was systematically killing the old myths. The latter fire was the fire of human industry and rationality, dragging the mysteries of the world into the harsh light of day. And he was right. We mapped the oceans. We classified the leviathans. We turned the demon of the sea into a biological specimen trapped in a formaldehyde jar. We told ourselves that the monsters weren't real, that they were just whales feeding and squids drifting in the dark. But science doesn't kill monsters. It just explains how they hunt. Today, as global temperatures rise and the chemistry of the deep ocean fundamentally alters, the delicate balance of the abyss is collapsing. The latter fire is heating the deep, quite literally. And as their deep water ecosystems face unprecedented shifts, these ancient, perfectly adapted predators are washing up on our shores with increasing frequency. We spent centuries terrified that the monster would reach up from the dark to pull us down. But the most unsettling implication of the Kraken legend isn't what the creature does to us. It's the realization that this creature survived the harshest environment on the planet for millions of years, hiding in the total blackness of the abyss. And now, for the first time in history, it is running out of places to hide.